I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, as he heads to Washington, we look at President Zelensky's 4-point peace plan and hear from Berlin as Chancellor Scholz survives an electoral challenge from left and right.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 23rd of September, 2 years and 217 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by Assistant Comment Editor Francis Dearnley, Senior Foreign Correspondent Roland Oliphant, and Berlin Correspondent James Rothwell. I started with the latest battlefield updates from Ukraine and Russia. Let's go back a bit. After we came off air on Friday, a load of things happened. It's almost as if they were just waiting for us to shut up. But anyway, overnight Friday, Saturday, Ukraine hit another ammo depot in Russia. This one was about 300 kilometers northwest of Moscow, actually just a few kilometers south of the massive blast last Thursday night last week at the Toropets ammunition storage site. I think it might be part of the Toropets ammo storage site, another bit of it a few k's away. I couldn't find a different name for it, but just so we're clear that area was hit twice, Wednesday, Thursday last week, and then overnight Friday, Saturday. On that blast last week, some information out over the weekend. On Friday, Estonian Colonel Unts Kivisalg, and thank you to the Estonian embassy. I spoke to them this morning to tell me how to pronounce that properly. I hope I've done it justice. But he's the head of Estonia's Defence Forces Intelligence Centre. He said the blast last Wednesday night had destroyed 2 to 3 months' worth of ammunition. Now, Colonel Kivisalg said the strike had caused 30,000 tons of Russian munitions to explode, adding that would equate to about 750,000 artillery shells. Now, Russian forces at the moment, on average, firing about 10,000 shells per week. So that, maths means that was about 75 weeks' worth of ammunition stored at the plant that was destroyed. Now, obviously, Russia has other supplies of artillery and ammunition, but no way of suggesting that was anything other than a very, very big attack on Russian ammunition depots. Now, on Saturday morning, another site, the Tikhoretsk site in Krasnodar, it's about 200 k's east of the Kerch Bridge. It also was hit. That is thought to have contained North Korean missiles, a bit like there were suggestions the one or the two up in Toropets may have had North Korean missiles as well. So that is 3 large strikes just in the space of a few days. Now, elsewhere this morning, Ukrainian forces said that they downed 3 of 4 Shahid type drones launched by Russia overnight last night, Sunday, Monday. This comes from the Air Force. They say 1 more drone and 2 Kh-59/69 variant cruise missiles failed to reach their targets, although they do say that was due to electronic warfare. We think that's the standard phraseology these days for electronic warfare. Now, I thought that was quite an interesting number, 4 drones. It's a constant, and there were deaths and injuries caused across the country, all across the country, from Sumy in the north to Zaporizhzhia down in the south. But note how those numbers are decreasing. Only 4 drones last night. Now, that may suggest that Ukraine's campaign of targeting ammunition storage sites is having some effect. However, Russia did launch at least 7 guided aerial bombs, the so-called glide bombs, at Zaporizhzhia yesterday, which resulted in partial destruction of a civilian apartment building. This comes from Oblast Governor Ivan Fedorov. 17 people injured there, no deaths reported as of this morning. That follows a similar Russian attack on a high-rise apartment building in Kharkiv on Saturday that wounded 21 people, including an 8-year-old child, Governor Oleh Sibinov reported there. Now, elsewhere, not a lot of movement on the front line, but continued push in particular by Russia in the southern Donetsk Oblast. This is west and southwest of Donetsk city itself, in the vicinity of Kharkov and Volodymyr. Now, Russia seems to be taking advantage of Ukraine's prioritization of that hard shoulder in front of their advance in Pokrovsk, which means that they haven't progressed any further towards Pokrovsk. But also the ongoing Kursk operation. Ukraine has diverted some resources up there. Francis Farrell, our friend and colleague at the Kyiv Independent, he says what Russia's trying to do is they've learned to target the weaker Ukrainian brigades, those that after months of fighting have been replenished with less experienced personnel and or have the same personnel but they're just exhausted. Now, in particular, Francis says the rotation of units off the front line is exploited by Russia for breakthroughs where they can make it. Now, the rotation of units of any size is a very, very tricky military manoeuvre, akin to trying to put on a new set of boxing gloves while still being in the ring, basically, in the fight. So if you're trying to take one unit or formation, brigade, division, whatever size it is, it really doesn't actually matter, one unit out of the fight whilst they're in contact with the enemy and put another fresher one in. So the whole handover, takeover of that fight and the coordination, it is an extremely difficult manoeuvre. You obviously don't want to come into a position where there's any blue on blue. You're killing your own side. So there's a sort of natural temptation to pause offensive action so you can get the next lot in safely. And of course, if the enemy can work out when and where that pause is, they can pile into that gap in time and space, if you like. So the whole handover, the rotation of forces, forward passage of lines, as it's called, as in for those literally going forward, taking over the fight, and the rearward passage of lines for those coming out of the fight. That is an extremely difficult military manoeuvre. It takes great coordination, great planning, great skill. It is difficult for the most prepared and experienced and units. So less trained units with people who haven't done this for very long, commanders who are tired, not functioning properly, all that kind of stuff is fraught with danger. And that seems to be what Russia is trying to exploit. They've got mass, and they have still a very low moral bar. They don't mind pushing people forward to just kill up to 1,000, we think, looking for these weaker points, and then they'll pile people in behind them where they find any areas of weakness. Now then, I mentioned Francis Fowler of the Kyiv Independent. Speaking of the paper, they've got a great story today citing Ukraine's State Security Service, the SBU. They say what they call a combat group operating under Russian orders has been neutralised, in their words, whilst preparing a violent seizure of power in Odessa. Now, in a post on Telegram, the SBU said the group had originally planned to seize local government buildings and state institutions in the city at the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion. But once that invasion had failed, they were told to lie low, await further instructions. Well, the SBU say the group was reactivated over this summer, so the SBU caught on with it shortly after. They say, SBU says the leader of the group had managed to recruit more than 24 people. Now, that leader comes from Crimea, but had served in the east, I think, from memory. He and his so-called deputy have been arrested, and the SBU are trying to round up all the others, apparently. That's not an ongoing story, but just speaks again of these so-called sleeper cells that are in Ukraine. Now then, that's it from the military updates. Francis, will you start to introduce, please, the big week on the diplomatic front for us?
Thanks, Dom. The big week is finally upon us in geopolitical terms, with Zelensky's visit to the United States formally underway now, where he will share his victory plan with allies and address the UN General Assembly, the summit of which is taking place as we speak. Roland's going to look into all of this in detail very shortly, including the timings of key speeches. But just to say, there is still no obvious movement on Storm Shadow weapons permissions, with President Biden, when asked directly by a journalist over the weekend whether he'd made a decision to allow Ukraine to use long-range weapons, simply replied, no. More positively for Kyiv, Zelensky has visited a Pennsylvania ammunition plant to personally thank the workers there producing some of the crucial munitions for Ukraine's defence. By all accounts, he was given a hero's welcome, and we've got some great photographs on our website at the moment. He also reiterated the line he said a few weeks ago, that it's too early to judge whether the Kursk operation has or is a success. What it has done, he said, is show our partners what we're capable of. Now, for those interested in this question about Kursk, I recommend listening to Wednesday's episode last week with Michael Bonnet of the Rand Corporation, who went into a very detailed military assessment of the state of that operation. Now, turning to the general diplomatic mood music, always a cacophony of noise at the best of times, but especially uproarious and chaotic at the times of a UN summit. President Macron of France has made his first major remarks with regard to Russia since the fallout of the general election he triggered before the Olympics. There, he reiterated that relations with Russia should be, to use his phrase, reconsidered after Moscow's war is over, urging people to imagine tomorrow's peace in Europe in a new form and in a new reality. To quote him, "We will have to think about a new form of organisation of Europe and recast our relations with Russia after the war." He then goes on, building a new international order is the biggest challenge, and that today it is incomplete and unfair. We need an order where some countries cannot block others, and where countries are represented with dignity. And therefore, this should be done in much fairer bodies, such as the UN, the World Bank, or the International Monetary Fund. Now, as discussed last week, he's not alone in thinking this. The atmosphere in the UN last year, and I'm sure will be the same this year, is very much pro-reform. Indeed, from not only the rest of the world, but also Western powers. But the challenge is how that would happen, given that the mechanisms in place within organisations like the UN are designed to maintain the status quo as the core of their very philosophy. Now, elsewhere on the continent, it's been a big 24 hours for Germany, which James will be turning to shortly, and its ramifications for Ukraine. Elsewhere, the Prime Minister of Denmark, Mette Frederiksen, has given her verdict on the errors made thus far by the West in its engagement on the war. A big mistake, she said, was to publicly discuss the red lines. We must stop this and not delay the delivery of what Ukraine needs. She said, going on to emphasise that Denmark doesn't set limits on aid as long as Ukraine complies with international law. She also spoke about how Putin's concessions will not lead to peace and that Russia is seeking to destabilise the world, including operations in Africa, the Middle East and hybrid threats in Europe, which I'll come to in a moment. I have to confess, Tom, I'm slightly puzzled as to what she means when she says it's a mistake for the West to discuss red lines, as many would argue that it's precisely what the West has not done, not discussing its red lines in Ukraine and therefore ceding the strategic initiative to Moscow, allowing them to escalate without the consequences for them being made clear. Perhaps she simply means that the West has made it clear that it has a few red lines on perhaps nuclear issues, on Article 5, but not many on others. So what she really means is it's a big mistake to publicly discuss the red lines that we have and not others. But again, I am slightly reading into her remarks there. Regardless, as I say, on the hybrid war question, more and more powers are waking up to the nature of Moscow's operations in that sphere. As per NBC News, Russia is reportedly expanding intelligence operations in Mexico to undermine the US and support for Ukraine. Citing unspecified US officials and former intelligence officers, it reported over the weekend that Russian intelligence services have been increasing their presence in Mexico for the past few years in order to spy on the US and to enhance propaganda meant to undermine, with those efforts now growing. US officials reportedly expressed concern over Russia's addition of dozens of employees to its embassy staff in Mexico City recently, despite notably lacking strong trade relations with Mexico, and are interpreting this growth as a return to Cold War-style tactics to enhance intelligence operations. The CIA Director William Burns recently noted that this increase is a result of the expulsion of Russian spies from Europe. I suppose they've got to go somewhere, at least the weather's warm. Now, it is one thing for the Kremlin to destabilise America's allies and interests in Europe, but historically, and I emphasise that word, historically, quite another to sow discord so close to America's own borders. The British interpretation and interception of the Zimmermann cable between the German Foreign Office in 1917 and Mexico that proposed a contract between the two countries, which would see the Mexicans recover Texas, Arizona and New Mexico, I think, if indeed this alliance was forged between Germany and Mexico, played a pivotal role in persuading the US to join the First World War against the Central Powers. Now, obviously, this is a very different set of circumstances, but given the attention paid to Mexico over the migration crisis in the US at present, and the historical issues that have been raised by countries interfering on nations on America's borders, there are, whilst opportunities for Moscow, also quite major risks. It's something that has blown out of into quite chaotic directions if one looks at the past century. So just something to be aware of. And since we're on the theme of Moscow's destabilisation measures, The Guardian reports that several fake news websites registered in the UK and made to resemble trusted British outlets are spreading disinformation about Western companies operating in Ukraine. Nothing especially new here, but still important to register. So the suspected Russian propaganda operation has prompted calls by several parliamentarians here for a change in the law to force UK-registered news websites to reveal their ownership, as does already happen in the EU. Now, these sites, I've had a look at them this morning, they're in English and, as it says, been registered in the UK. Their output has then been picked up, according to The Guardian, disseminated in Ukraine, where the UK media is traditionally considered more reliable and trustworthy. Content on the site, I would say, does appear to be AI generated. It's just very formulaic, very clunky. The headlines sometimes don't quite make complete sense. The analysis by The Guardian suggests that the original text has been created by a Russian speaker and then translated by AI and proliferated, presumably by AI and bots as well. As I say, a pretty modest operation by the standards of some we've covered, but nonetheless, it speaks to the way in which cutting-edge technology is seemingly being deployed in new ways to sow discord. But that's small compared to, of course, the big stories of the week around Zelensky's visit to the UN and the United States. So very happy to hand over to Roland to discuss that crucial trip and its ramifications.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. Before we do turn to Roland, if I could just take you back to your comments about Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark. So her comment there saying a big mistake was to publicly discuss the red lines. We must stop this and not delay the delivery of what Ukraine needs. As you say, interesting. Many would argue that the West has not talked specifically about red lines, but the argument's been out there, and we and other people in the sort of commentariat and the analysis and what have you have pulled it apart. And in the information void there, you're right, Russia's piled in and got the initiative there in terms of that narrative. Sorry, clunky word warning there. But I'm just interested, do you think she's trying to lance the boil here by using the red line phrase so that it has to be addressed? Or just by coming out with that statement, a big mistake was to publicly discuss the red lines, we must stop this and not delay, la 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 la. Do you think she's just getting her two penneth in ahead of this big week in the UN? Not forgetting, of course, that there was a time when she was very highly considered as the next NATO Secretary General. So she's got a voice. She's obviously not got the job, but she is a big voice in terms of geopolitical strategy and security. So her saying something like this is not by accident for my money, and I think it's all to do with the UN. But just before I go to Roland, I'd be interested in your thoughts just on that idea.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think any major statement put out by a world leader or a senior political figure at the moment should be interpreted as trying to lay the groundwork for important conversations taking place at the General Assembly. I quoted those remarks earlier on from President Macron, where he talks about the unfairness institutionally within some of those major organisations. And then, yes, I think these kind of statements with regard to the war in Ukraine are trying to set a tone for the discussion, particularly by those countries who perhaps are not going to be at the very top table of those conversations that are taking place between President Zelensky, the United States. Perhaps London will be there because of the relevance to storm shadows. Perhaps France will be too in the room. But Denmark and some of these other players are likely to be their role in supporting in the background with their diplomats jumping between meetings, trying to put pressure on those powers who can make crucial decisions at this juncture to do so. Now, specifically on this point about red lines, as I say, it's not quite clear what she means when she's talking about the red lines. As I say, I think my interpretation would be that she means how few red lines there have been, perhaps, and that really the whole conversation around those red lines is unhelpful. But I don't think it would be fair to point at her and say that she's advocating for strategic ambiguity, which of course has been the orthodoxy really that's been adopted by the West ever since the beginning of the war, because that, I think, is something that she has criticised in the past. Clearly, what she's really calling for is far more robustness and action from the West in terms of military support for Kyiv. And so I think it's in that context that she should be understood.
Thanks, Francis. Yeah. Speaking about the wider context, so Roland, President Zelensky is off to the States. Now, wasn't he doorstepped by journalists on his way out of Kyiv, and he let slip some details about his 4-point peace plan that's got us all looking at it. But what happened, and what's he been saying before he actually left for Washington?
No, you're right. He's off on the big trip, as Francis has walked us through, really. He did speak to some journalists before he went. I think the conversation happened on Friday. I'm not clear if it was a doorstep or a briefing or something. I'm not sure how you would doorstep Zelensky, to be honest. There's a lot of sandbags and checkpoints to get through to get to the presidential administration. But look, the message he gave is this. He said there's basically 4 planks to this plan. He hasn't given the details. He's saving the details for his appearances in the United States this week. But, okay, there's 4 planks. Number 1, security guarantees with harder assurances akin to the defence guarantee that comes from NATO membership. So that draws a distinction between the assurances that Ukraine has gained through individual kind of security pacts, including with the United Kingdom, including with the United States and several other allied countries. Ukrainians welcomed them when they came along, but they're looking for something really solid, something that is along the lines of, in the same kind of league as Article 5, basically. Plank number 2, that's the Kursk operation, essentially taking land in order to become a bargaining chip at the negotiating table. So he basically confirmed that the Kursk operation is part of this victory plan, as we speculated and reported when it was happening. What is the objective? What's going on there? I think we're right to see it in that context. The third plank, specific, underlining the word specific here, that's what's being quoted, advanced weapons. Those advanced weapons are not named. We know, of course, there's this big conversation around Storm Shadow and other long-range missiles. Listeners will be familiar with the debate around that over the past few weeks. We thought that there was going to be a green light when our current Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, went to Washington to speak to Joe Biden. It didn't happen. Then there was talk that maybe it will happen in United Nations General Assembly week. That is this week. So maybe it's about that. It might also be around air defences. That's another big issue, possibly, and I'm really speculating here. Maybe it's got something to do with NATO shooting down drones over Western Ukraine. Don't know. I am speculating. But specific advanced weapons, I'm not telling you which ones I want, he said. And the fourth plank is discussion of Ukraine's economic recovery. The way the FT put it is joint development of Ukraine's economy together with its partners. Slightly clunky, that, but I think we get the picture. We know Ukraine has suffered massively economically during this war and is going to need help getting back on its feet. So those are what we understand are the 4 elements of the plan. The details we don't yet have. So the details should become public, I assume, sometime during the course of this week. I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail shortly because he's also given an interview to the New Yorker, which is interesting. But just so listeners are aware of the timetable, so President Zelensky is already in the United States. He is meant to address a meeting of the United States Security Council tomorrow that's being called by Ukraine's allies. The day after that, so on Wednesday, he is meant to address the United Nations General Assembly. This is big week. He keeps saying big week. Like it's an episode in the Strategic Joint Bomber Offensive or something. But it is a diplomatic big week. It's the annual jamboree when world leaders, all kinds of world leaders are going to be there. Benjamin Netanyahu is going to be there. There's going to be all kinds of reasons to look at what happens in New York this week. Zelensky's day on the stage, we believe, is on Wednesday. And then on Thursday, that's when he's meant to have separate meetings, according to the White House, with Joe Biden and with Kamala Harris. And Zelensky's also said he intends to meet with Donald Trump as well to explain this victory plan to Donald Trump. We are not, well, I personally am not clear on the timing of that or whether Donald Trump's camp has confirmed it's happening. But that's his plan for the next few days. Now, President Zelensky has also given a much more detailed interview to the New Yorker's Joshua Yaffa. It is worth reading in full, as Mr. Zelensky's interviews usually are, as most stuff that Josh Yaffa writes, to be honest. But I've been through it. It does give a few more details, not too much more detail of the specifics of the plan, but it talks a bit more about his thinking behind it, which I think is interesting. And I'm just going to read out a paragraph here, which I think encapsulates the whole thing. So in this section of the interview, Josh has asked President Zelensky about the objective of the plan. And he says, well, the victory plan is a plan that swiftly strengthens Ukraine. A strong Ukraine will force Putin to the negotiating table. I'm convinced of that. It's just that before I was only saying it, and now I've put it all on paper with, and I've highlighted this bit, specific arguments and specific steps to strengthen Ukraine during the months of October, November and December and to enable a diplomatic end of the war. The difference this time will be that Putin will have grasped the depth of this plan, of our partner's commitment to strengthening us, and he will realise an important fact, that if he is not ready to end this war in a way that is fair and just, and instead wishes to continue to try to destroy us, then a strengthened Ukraine will not let him do so. Not only that, but continuing to pursue that goal would also considerably weaken Russia, which would threaten Putin's own position. Now, I've picked out that paragraph for two reasons. The first thing is it gives you a time frame that tells you how urgent this is, right? October, November, December. Zelensky wants this thing done, dusted, nailed down before January, before Joe Biden leaves office. And he talks about that very specifically. And he talks about how Joe Biden's got this opportunity to go down in history as the guy who nailed down an eventual peace. And I think that speaks to the nerves around the election, the nerves around the chance of Donald Trump becoming president again, and just the sense that this is a crucial period of time for Ukraine. So that's one thing. The other thing, the reason I pulled this out, is because I think that this speaks to... We don't have the details. I haven't seen the details yet. We will, and we'll talk about those details when they come out. But the principle here is, I think, very sound. All right? And it observes a basic tenet of the bleeding obvious, I would say, which is that battlefields are negotiating tables, quite literally. There's not really a distinction between... I mean, there is a distinction, obviously, but people try to make this dichotomy between let's not have war, let's have talks, let's have negotiations instead of fighting. Literally, negotiations are going on the battlefield right down. You fight for the upper hand, to go into talks, to compel your opponent to enter talks or to entertain peace in a weaker position, you with the upper hand. It's exactly what we're seeing with these Israeli strikes on Hezbollah right now. All right, that's just war. That's the way it goes. And this discussion of, okay, I think it's fair to say that Zelensky here, the tenor of everything he's saying, his political posture, the rhetoric that's coming out of Kyiv over the past several weeks and months, I think we can talk about him trying to set up the chessboard for the end game, but a relatively favourable end game. And I think the idea of getting it through on the battlefield, sending that message to the Kremlin that, look, you're not going to make much more gain by fighting, and illustrating that the West is solidly behind us, to force the Kremlin to weigh up its cost-benefits analysis here, is very sound in principle. And for that, for my money, Dom, my last kind of thought on this that I leave you with, I think that makes, we've talked about Kursk already. Kursk is obviously a critical part of that because it gives the Ukrainians a chunk of Russian land to play with. The other critical part is what's happening in Donbass. If this is going to work, the Ukrainians are going to have to stabilize that line somehow, because at the moment, this sense, at least the trajectory of things down there, is not looking good. Kristen Familler, our friend of the podcast, has a very worrying dispatch in today's FT, or on the FT website at least, talking about exactly that. So if this plan this week, these coming months, are critical diplomatically, that means that what happens on the battlefield is also critical diplomatically. I'll leave you with that thought. The other thought, of course, is there are all kinds of unknowns, and we can talk about theories of victory, which is something that hasn't really been properly ironed out throughout the war. But that's basically the outline of this, let's say it once again, big week.
Yeah, thanks, Roland. Let's not start talking about theories of victory, because we'll only get you-know-who going on about Napoleon again. But before I go over to James, could I ask you, it's interesting you say there about you highlight Zelensky's reference to time, and yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's all to do with the US election. But the Biden administration is under some pressure at the moment, I think. Just be interested on your view, on what pressure you think Joe Biden is under, given the US seems to be losing a bit of influence, or the influence is being watered down over Israel, for example, and the prosecution of Israel's campaign against Hamas and Hezbollah. Their policy, US policy there, seems to be in a state of some flux, or their ability to influence in a state of some flux. And then obviously in Ukraine with the issue about long range strikes and Ukraine's ability here. They've shown they can do long-range strikes, just with, we don't know what weapons they're using, but they are hitting these things hundreds of kilometres away from the border with great effect. The amount of ammunition they're wiping out. So we're almost moving on from what stamp, what sticker, what flag was on the side of the missile or the drone or whatever that landed. It almost doesn't matter. I mean, it's kind of watering down the power of the escalation argument. So I just wonder what your thoughts were on the pressure that the Biden administration is under right now in order to do something, and also for Joe Biden personally to secure some sort of legacy.
I mean, Joe Biden is, well, as we know, he's got this reputation as a bit of a stubborn chap. I'm not sure appeals to his legacy to force him to change his mind right now are going to really get through. The key issue here right now is that this is an administration on its last legs, right? And everybody is now looking to November, to the election, and then to the inauguration in January. And that has massive impacts well beyond the United States. The immediate impact on the diplomatic clout aspect in the United States is that Biden's preoccupied. He doesn't want to do anything that's going to create kind of political headwinds for Kamala Harris's campaign. And we know about the sensitivities around providing more money for Ukraine, about the rhetoric around escalation and things like that. I think this is a White House that's been very sensitive to that kind of rhetoric and sensitive to the way particularly Donald Trump might weaponize that kind of rhetoric during the election. So I think that's a massive bit of pressure on him. And I'm not quite sure how to link the situation in Israel, Lebanon, Gaza with this. But yeah, you're absolutely right that the United States has really struggled to crack the diplomatic whip with its Israeli ally in a way. And you can see the kind of frustration coming out of the State Department especially. And we understand that you're talking there about legacy. Part of Biden's hope for a legacy was to get a Gaza ceasefire nailed down before he leaves office, possibly before November, for obvious reasons. And we've seen reporting out of Washington in the past few days saying that, well, the president is now coming to terms with the fact that that's probably not going to happen. It's going to be really, really difficult. So in terms of pressure, I think a lot of it is domestic, and it's about the great grinding cycle of American politics, which chews up all before it. That is American democracy, rightly or wrongly, and it has an impact everywhere. We're talking about Volodymyr Zelensky and also Vladimir Putin and also all of NATO watching what happens in November. Putin kind of thinking, well, I need to know who's going to be in the White House before I decide which way I'm going to go. Is it going to be Donald Trump, who might be more sympathetic to me or not? For the same reasons, basically, on the opposite side of the coin, the Ukrainians feeling the same thing. Well, I was speaking to someone in Israel the other day about that other story who made the point to me, look, one reason things don't seem to move is because Benjamin Netanyahu wants to know who's going to be the next president of the United States before he starts making commitments. So it's something that, because of America's great reach and great influence and all of this electoral cycle has impacts, well, beyond the United States itself.
Thanks, Roland. Absolutely fascinating, to borrow a phrase. Now then, speaking about the electoral cycle, James, welcome back to the pod. I haven't chatted for a little while. Germany, where you are, Berlin. Chancellor Olaf Scholz, his party, SPD, just survived, managed to hang on, depending on how you put it. State elections in the East just narrowly came in first place, but not all good news for him, because was it a protest vote that the SPD got or what have you to try and fend off the left and the right from the AfD and the BSW. So how are you reading it, and where now is Chancellor Scholz and Germany, a major power in Europe, big ally of Ukraine? Yeah, we've had a few issues, but major ally of Ukraine. Where is Chancellor Scholz this morning? Welcome back, James.
Thanks. Yeah. Hi, everyone. So these were state elections in East Germany in the state of Brandenburg. And the state elections in the German system are a bit like midterms, really. They're a good bellwether of which way the voters are leaning. They don't have an impact on foreign policy that much, but the candidates who run in them do talk about foreign policy a lot. And in East Germany, the war in Ukraine was a big focus, both military support for Ukraine by Berlin and the fact that the war has brought many Ukrainian refugees into East Germany. And as you say, this was a victory for Olaf Scholz. This wasn't what the polls had suggested. They had indicated that actually the AfD, the hard right, was going to come out on top. But Mr. Scholz's party just about edged in front of them with 30% of the vote. And I think the reason this election is very interesting is because it shows that the German government is having to react when regional parties start agitating over in the former communist East about Ukraine. Migration was a big topic in this debate. I was in Brandenburg last week, spoke to voters there who complained a lot about Ukrainian refugees they claimed coming in en masse and filling up the hospitals, that sort of thing. Of course, there's been lots of refugees from various countries coming into the east of Germany, so it's not just about Ukrainians, but it is a vector of frustration in East Germany. And this might explain why Chancellor Scholz last week announced this decision to introduce passport controls within the constraints of the Schengen zone around Germany. And he did that in response to calls to increase border security. Now, will this have an impact on the sort of bigger chess pieces in terms of Germany's relationship with Ukraine and the war? I think it's an early sign that this could be a cause for concern. It's an indication that the so-called mainstream parties in Germany are having to listen very carefully to what the hard right and the hard left in the east of Germany are saying on this particular issue. And it also raises questions about Olaf Scholz's future at the top of the SPD. As you allude to, Dominic, Scholz and Germany have been big friends to Ukraine, but they've also endured a lot of criticism in terms of reluctance to supply weapons, in terms of a slightly faltering start, in terms of its support for Kyiv at the beginning of the war. And as Scholz continues to run into all this trouble, even though he came first place in this state election in Brandenburg, there's mounting speculation that he might be replaced as the SPD's candidate for Chancellor in the general elections that are due in Germany next year. And the favourite, who will be well known, I would imagine, to Ukraine, the latest listeners, is Boris Pistorius, the German defence minister. Now, he's been one of the more hawkish, by Germany's standards, voices on Ukraine. He's the one who's in favour of bringing back conscription, of making Germany a major security partner in Europe. He's always been more keen than Mr. Scholz has been in the context of giving long-range missiles to Ukraine and so on. So, in a strange twist of irony, if the momentum continues and Mr. Scholz may potentially be removed essentially as the head of the party before that general election, you may get a bigger friend of Ukraine coming into the top of the SPD before the general elections in Germany. But the big picture here is that the hard right, the far left and so on have still performed very strongly in this state election. They're going to perform very strongly in the general elections. And that's a concern from a Ukrainian perspective, because these populist parties, the AfD and the BSW that we talked a little bit about last week, they're vehemently opposed to military support for Kyiv. And being East Germans, being from the former GDR, the communist Russian ruled regime, they have this sort of sympathy and nostalgia towards Putin. And their role in German politics is getting bigger. And that could be a big concern going forward.
God, it's so interesting. You can get absolutely wrapped around the axle and be a politics news junkie, but this whole democracy thing, it's just so beautifully, brilliantly flawed. Yes, anyway, I'm fascinated by the whole thing. So where are you putting your money then, James? I mean, Boris Pistorius is a big character. I can't think of any mistakes he's made, really. No controversies in recent years. He's high profile. So what do you reckon? Go on then, pin the tail on the donkey. What's going to happen?
Well, if you look at the opinion polls, the CDU, the party that was formerly led by Angela Merkel, is probably, based on the current projections, going to beat the SPD anyway in those general elections. They're polling quite far in first place at the moment. And if we step back from Mr. Scholz for just a moment, the current Chancellor, there's a new kid on the block running the CDU, Friedrich Merz, who is being considered over here the sort of chancellor in waiting. He's borrowed from the playbook of the AfD in terms of very tough rhetoric on migration. But his party, having been in opposition over the past few years, has been putting a lot of pressure on the Scholz government to be more supportive of Ukraine, particularly in the context of arms deliveries. They've got a big dilemma coming up, right? At the moment, they've got this big lead in the polls. They are probably not going to become complacent about forming the next government after these elections, but they've got a good chance. But they've also got to deal with this growing unease in the east of Germany and elsewhere about Berlin's support for Ukraine. Will their position on Ukraine, which is currently very supportive, shift during this long election campaign of about a year? Will they start getting a little bit more sceptical towards the war in Ukraine? And of course, what stage will the war be by the time this election happens in a year? That's a big open question too. But Friedrich Merz, the head of the CDU, he is looking like the guy who, based on the current polls at least, is going to lead Germany. And as I said, I think it's fair to say he is more hawkish on Ukraine than Mr. Scholz. But can he maintain that position in the light of these election results in the east of Germany with the AfD? And what is his big picture position going to be on this war? I think that's going to come under a huge amount of scrutiny in the months to come.
Thanks, James. And I didn't mean to sound exasperated with democracy. I'm a big fan of democracy, as you may have noticed. But it's just like, I think democracy is like your best mate who kicks over a glass of red wine on your cream carpet. But there we go. Francis, I'd be very keen on your observations. You've just had a download from James and Roland. Do you have any thoughts on anything the boys are saying there?
Yeah, it's really interesting hearing perspective on both on the subjects we've just been discussing. To James's point there, I think Pistorius is a very impressive figure. He's very articulate and obviously brilliant in the hawkish terms on Ukraine. But can they risk it? Can they risk somebody like him, given the way in which Ukraine has become a lightning rod issue for the left and the right in Germany? It's difficult to say, but I think that's a key issue. The other, of course, issue relating to Germany is around contagion in Europe. Will other countries look at what's happened in Germany because of its strong stance on the war in Ukraine and think, crikey, we need to be a little bit careful here ourselves that we don't end up in a situation where we're threatened from both the right and the left in order because of the issues going on, and therefore need to adapt our strategies and our lines on Ukraine accordingly. That's the sort of thing that you wouldn't necessarily see happening publicly, but one can imagine those kind of conversations taking place among political strategists in various countries there where that might be a relevant thing in the months ahead. But just going back on to what Roland was talking about earlier on, and he said that it feels like Zelensky is setting up the board for the end game. I agree, and I think the thing that's relevant to that, though, is to recognise that end games in games of chess usually take a very long time indeed, sometimes as long as the conventional game itself. And so I think the idea that we can see, and I'm not saying Roland was saying this, but I think that there's some people saying, oh, it's actually conceivable this war might be over by the end of the year if things go a certain way. I think that is very, very personally, I think, very unlikely given the length of time that it will take in order to try and finalise some of these things if we are in a situation where Ukraine is willing to sign a negotiation, likewise with Russia. But the other key issue relevant to all of this is the degree to which, and we don't know the answer, that Zelensky's hedging his bets, that he's thinking, OK, if Harris wins, then we'll be in a totally different situation. And therefore, all of this talk about negotiations, all of this talk about support now is about banking for the worst case scenario of a Trump victory. And then in that situation, he says, well, at least we've got some support coming in. At least we may well have the grounds laid for talks of negotiations that are more favourable to us than we could expect in other situations. That's what they're doing with this work at the moment. But if Harris wins, perhaps all bets will be off. Perhaps the negotiations talk will dissipate and Ukraine will think that if it gets more support, that's long-term commitments from a Harris White House, we're back where we were before these talk about negotiations really got pace. All lots of caveat points there, but I think it's relevant when we're talking about the upcoming months that time is an issue, but also the political strategy is an issue. But as you were saying, Roland, there's a lot of things that are just basically on pause, on deep freeze until we get those November elections in the United States. And that's true in the Middle East, and it's especially true in Ukraine.
Oh, thanks, Francis. Thanks, Roland and James. Yeah, I think you're on the money there, Francis. Of course, he has to have a plan for the rest of the year now, as in what not just his 4-point plan, but also how to handle events running up to the election and post that, and who comes in. But I think there's a very, very long way to go yet in this war. I think we've got a couple of years left. But anyway, I have been very wrong before, so who knows. Right then, let's start drawing things to a close. Can we go have an interest in your final thoughts, chaps? Roland, can we start with you, please?
Final thoughts, I've got so many whooshing around my head. I don't think Francis is wrong about pointing out how long endgames would be. I don't think he's wrong about this hedging of bets and stuff. I think that's true. There are other factors at play here besides the American election, of course. I think that sometimes we get a bit hung up on... I don't think we just get hung up on the American election. I think we tend to get hung up on whatever it is we're discussing in that particular episode for obvious reasons, because it's what our attention's caught. But we have to remember this winter is going to be brutal in Ukraine. We're talking about kind of 18-hour days without power. If you've ever been through a winter in Eastern Europe, you know how bad that is going to be. It's going to be thuggish, is the only way I can put it. It's going to be really, really challenging. We've reported endlessly about Ukraine's problems with air defense, problems with not enough shells, with not enough men, with insufficient defenses in Donbass, with all kinds of pressure building, huge damage, fatigue, all of that. There's reasons beside Donald Trump to want to start bringing this thing to a close, if possible. And that brings me to my real final thought, because... unless Francis is going to speak again. No, Francis is shaking his head. Okay, we're not going to get any Napoleonisms in that case, so I can say this safely. Theories of victory. All right, it's been a problem for the West throughout this war. It's not a problem for the Russians, really. I mean, the Russians know what they want. I mean, they adapt it according to how well they're doing on the battlefield, and they can go from a full contest of Kiev to, okay, we'll just take the land bridge and the Donbass region or whatever. But the Russians know what they're doing, or Vladimir Putin does. I'll push as far as I can, and so on. Right? For the West, this has been a complete shambles. I mean, if you were a school teacher writing an end-of-year report, I mean, must try better would not even scrape it. It's been pathetic. I literally can't believe that I'm thinking back to sitting down opposite a very, very senior British official who just said there's no... What's the plan, guys? There's no plan. Basically, I've told this story on this podcast so many times, I'm almost tired of repeating it. The message was at the time, we're not going to be pinned down on a theory of victory. It's for the Ukrainians to decide. You know, what you say to that is that, look, if you're going to help these guys, you need to know what you're trying to achieve. If you're going to provide them with weapons, with kit, with whatever else, there has never been a satisfactory answer. And we've always understood ever since then that even the Americans, who are meant to be setting the pace and the most influential, have not had a serious theory of victory, certainly not one that's been articulated publicly, certainly not one that we've been able to put our hands on. There's diplomatic reasons for that. One of the reasons is that people don't want to talk about it because they know that different countries have different attitudes to the costs, to the dangers of inflicting a full-scale defeat on Russia, of what it might do to Russia itself, all kinds of things. But the bottom line has been that the collective West has been bereft of an end point to which it is trying to get. And I think that's informed the kind of dilly-dallying on various kinds of support for Ukraine. Zelensky talks about, in his interview with Josh Yaffa in the New Yorker, he talks about this victory plan as a bridge to get to the diplomatic stage of the talks. And I feel that part of that bridge is going to be saying to President Biden, saying to Kamala Harris, saying to Donald Trump when he sees them, saying to the other world leaders when he sees them, look, we've been in this holding pattern for 2-3 years. Now's the time to say, this is how we want it to end. So I'll be fascinated to see whether over the next weeks or months we begin to finally get some kind of consolidated, coherent messaging out of various Western capitals about what it is they're trying to achieve, other than standing with Ukraine for as long as it takes, ... whatever that means.
Thanks, as ever, Roland. James Rothwell, here I am stuck in the middle with you. What are your final thoughts, please?
Yeah, I think I will leave with you my final thoughts on the German elections and just bring that name up again because it's going to be very important. Friedrich Merz, the leader of the CDU, the centre-right party in Germany, as I said, described by many as Germany's Chancellor in waiting. As an opposition leader, he's been pushing the German government to do more on Ukraine. But we've got this problem, this dilemma, which is that there's trouble stirring in the former communist East. The East Germans are not happy about the current government's position on Ukraine. Does that mean Mr. Merz will need to change course? And just to engage slightly with Roland's point about the future vision, Germany under Chancellor Scholz has tried to be almost a bit of a passenger in this war. He likes to talk about being in lockstep with the US administration when it comes to making big decisions on things like weapons deliveries. But many in Europe are looking to Germany to become a bigger player in European security. And if there is a new chancellor at the end of next year, when the outlook for this war or potentially ongoing or even concluded negotiations may be a factor, it's going to be very interesting to see how much of a role that new Germany wants to play.
It will indeed. Thank you, James. Thanks so much for that. Great to have you back. Francis, would you like to close today's episode with your final thoughts, please?
Napoleon!
I'm coming to that, Roland. Yesterday was David's 33rd birthday, and I know listeners are keen to hear an update on the various projects we're working on in his memory. And to answer that, there are many, of course, extraordinary messages that have come in, and many of them are asking about whether there'll be a fundraiser. And as soon as we have had that confirmed by the family, we will of course let you know. His loved ones are also planning for the funeral to be streamed live for those who wish to watch around the world. Once we have more details on the date and time, we will of course let you know. I know many of you would like to join us digitally in giving David the send-off he deserves. I also wanted to flag a detailed tribute paid by the Press Gazette, which includes some of the public tributes that were paid to him on our obituary page and others by personal friends that they've spoken to. It also dispels a myth that I've been wanting to dispel for some time, which is that I was and am the Napoleonic obsessive, okay? Right? As is made clear in the Press Gazette piece, and as David, if he were here, would agree, he is the one that is obsessed with Napoleon. He's read all of the Patrick O'Brien books. He'd read all of the biographies of the Napoleonic marshals. He and I would debate often about it, but he was the real aficionado, okay? So this idea that it's always me bringing up Bonaparte, it ain't true. And so it's in writing in the Press Gazette, and I'm very pleased that it is there, all right? And if he were here, he would be nodding along and he'd be raising his hands in agreement. So good to put the record straight. We will add a link in the show notes to that piece in the Press Gazette. And as I say, thank you all very much again for all of your extraordinary messages, which have been a huge support to us and to his family at this time.
Oh, well, thanks for that, Francis. Not quite sure where that little outburst came from, but no, thank you. You've blown apart the Bonaparte phony bony pony story. I can still do it. Folks, thanks so much for joining us, and thank you for your continued support and all your messages. We will be back tomorrow, same time, same place. The Napoleon chap, hater, lover, is going to be in the chair tomorrow, but I'll be somewhere else. I'll be here. But until tomorrow, thank you so much for joining us from the Telegraph newspaper in London. I wish you all a very good afternoon. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from the Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description in this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.